Oscar rubbed his eyes tiredly, looking at the screen of the old computer. The pharmacy was silent, with only the gentle hum of the air conditioner breaking the peace of the late afternoon. Margaret walked into the staff room, holding a mop. "You stayed up late again, boy?" she asked caringly. "You have to work tomorrow at 6. Oscar tore his eyes away from the monitor. "I have to finish a report for Richard," he answered tiredly. Margaret set the mop down against the wall and sat down opposite it. "This Richard," she shook her head. "He's just bullying you because he knows you're not going anywhere. How many months have you been underpaid?" 4. Oscar took an envelope out of the drawer. "There's only 2/3 of what was promised. He says sales are down, he needs to save money. And he's driving around in a new Lexus." Margaret snorted indignantly. "You should look for another job, son." Oscar stared silently out the window at the regional manager's shiny black car. "Where would I go? The hospital is downsizing, private clinics don't hire without experience, and the rent has to be paid." The phone in his pocket vibrated. Oscar read the message from the landlord and felt his insides shrink. "Mr. Baker?" Margaret asked sympathetically, noticing the change in his face. "He gave me until Friday," Oscar answered quietly. "He says business is business. Is there anything I can do to help?" Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. "No need," he tried to smile. "You go home. I'll finish here and leave too." When Margaret left, Oscar closed his eyes. Memories flooded back. Graduating from medical school, his mother's proud look, dreams of his own practice, and then the terrible diagnosis, the huge debts for treatment, and finally, the loneliness after her death. He looked at his watch, 11:30. The last bus was leaving in 20 minutes. He began to quickly gather his papers when he noticed a shortage in the cash register. $30. "That's all I needed," Oscar muttered, counting the cash for the 3rd time. He took out his wallet and pulled out the last of his money. Now he'd have to live on noodles until payday, but he had no choice. Richard was just waiting for an excuse to cut his pay even more. After closing the pharmacy, Oscar went out into the cold autumn night. At the bus stop, he reread the message from Richard. "Meeting tomorrow at 8. Prepare a report on last week's cash discrepancies, and don't be late." In the almost empty bus, Oscar looked out the window at the night city. There, in the brightly lit buildings, another life was in full swing, a life he could only dream of. His one-room apartment greeted him with the usual coolness. The heating was turned on for only 2 hours in the morning and evening. There was an unpaid electricity bill on the table and half a carton of milk and stale bread in the fridge. Oscar turned on his laptop. He had to prepare a report for tomorrow's meeting. Sleep would have to be postponed, even though the alarm would go off at 5 in the morning. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the numbers. He had once dreamed of saving lives, of helping people. And now he was stuck in this vicious circle of pennilessness and hopelessness, seeing no way out. It seemed that all paths were closed, all opportunities were lost. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Oscar looked at his watch in surprise. It was almost midnight. Behind the door stood Mr. Baker, his landlord. "Mr. Richardson," he began without greeting, "I understand your difficulties, but you have to understand me too. 2 months in arrears is too much." Oscar leaned tiredly against the door jamb. "I'll get my paycheck next week and right away." "Next week may be too late," Mr. Baker interrupted. "I have solvent tenants. Either you find the money by Friday or look for another place to live." When the landlord left, Oscar stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the empty street. One thought was running through his mind: how to live until his next paycheck, and would there even be a next paycheck? The clock read 5 minutes past 10. Oscar started to prepare to close the pharmacy when a sharp knock on the door made him flinch. Behind the glass, he saw a woman holding a little boy in her arms. "I'm sorry. We're just about to close," he said through the door. "Please, open up." The woman's voice trembled with desperation. "My son needs his medicine. He's having an asthma attack." Oscar looked at the child. The boy was breathing heavily, his face pale. Without hesitation, he opened the door. "Come in quickly," he said, letting them in. The woman was exhausted and scared. "Thank you. I'm Laura Wilson. We need Ventolin, but I don't have," she stammered. "I don't have the full amount." Oscar walked over to the shelf with the medicine. "How much do you have?" $35, Laura whispered, pulling out crumpled bills. "I'm a nurse, but after the hospital downsizing," she clutched her son tighter. "Please, is there any way?" "The inhaler costs $120, Oscar said, looking at the price. Laura looked at him desperately. "I'll give you the rest as soon as I can. Here's my phone number. Address right now. Michael is very sick." The boy coughed and his breathing became even more labored. Oscar remembered his mother, her last days, when there was not enough money for medicine. He silently took out the inhaler and handed it to Laura. "Here you go." "But how?" "Take it quickly," he interrupted her. "The child needs help." Laura gave her son the medicine with trembling hands. In a few minutes, the boy's breathing began to stabilize. "I don't know how to thank you." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You saved my Michael." "It's okay." Oscar took $35 and handed over a check. "You can bring the rest when you can." When they left, he opened the cash register and put in his last $85 he had been saving for rent. Now, he had nothing left. Mr. Baker would be furious. Suddenly, the door opened. Richard Pierce stood on the doorstep. "Working overtime?" His eyes looked around the room coldly. "I hope the cash register is down to the penny." Oscar felt his insides go cold. "Yes, of course." "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock I'll see you at the main office," Richard said, "and bring a report on all the transactions for today." When the manager left, Oscar sank heavily into his chair. He knew that he had done the right thing, but the price of this act could be too high. Without the money for rent, he risked ending up on the street. But the image of the sick boy stood before his eyes, and he realized that he could not do otherwise. At 7 in the morning, Oscar was already standing at the entrance to the pharmacy. His hands were shaking as he tried to get the key into the keyhole. He hadn't slept the night before, replaying the events of last night over and over in his head. He heard footsteps behind him. Oscar turned around and saw Richard Pierce, accompanied by an unfamiliar woman in a strict suit. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson," Richard greeted coldly. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Donovan, our chief auditor." The woman gave Oscar an appraising look. "Do you always open the pharmacy at this early hour?" "I had to prepare a report," Oscar replied, finally opening the door. Richard went to the cash register. "Well, let's start the audit. Show us the cash register for yesterday." Oscar took out the documents with trembling hands. Mrs. Donovan took them and began to methodically check each entry. "Interesting," she suddenly said. "Here is a sale of a Ventolin inhaler at $22.50, but the payment is incomplete." Richard turned sharply to Oscar. "Explain." "It was an emergency," Oscar began. "The child needed medicine." "An emergency?" Mrs. Donovan interrupted him. "And you decided to break every possible company rule?" Oscar felt his palms sweat. "I put my money where my mouth is." Richard laughed. "That's even worse. You have no right to interfere with the company's financial operations. This is a serious violation." The room fell silent. Mrs. Donovan was writing something down in her notebook, and Richard was nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "We're waiting for you at the main office at 8, he finally said. "Mr. Harrison wants to speak to you personally." Oscar felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Mr. Harrison, the owner of the entire chain of pharmacies, had never spoken to ordinary employees. If he is called to see him, things are really bad. "I'll give the cash register to Nancy," he began. "No," Mrs. Donovan said sharply. "You're coming with us right now. Another employee will take over the cash register." The drive to the main office seemed like an eternity. Oscar looked out the window of Richard's car and thought that he would lose not only his job, but also his last chance to pay the rent. His eyes were drawn to little Michael's face and his heavy breathing. But was one good deed worth the price he would have to pay? The Medcare headquarters building towered over the city like a glass skyscraper. A security guard led them to the elevator. Rising to the 25th floor, they found themselves in a huge reception area. "Mr. Harrison is waiting for you," the receptionist said, pointing to a massive oak door. Richard and Mrs. Donovan looked at each other. The woman handed the network owner a folder with a report. "We have found serious violations, sir." Mr. Harrison, a gray-haired man in his 60s, looked at Oscar carefully. "Take a seat, Mr. Richardson. Tell me everything from the beginning." Mr. Harrison read the report in silence, looking up at Oscar from time to time. There was an oppressive silence in the office, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. "I see a violation of corporate rules here," he finally said. "Incomplete payment for goods, interference with cash transactions." Richard took a step forward. "Sir, I recommend your immediate dismissal. These actions are unacceptable." Mr. Harrison raised his hand to stop him. "Tell me, Mr. Richardson, did you know this woman, Laura Wilson?" "No, sir," Oscar answered. "I've never seen her before." The chain owner stood up and walked over to the large window. "I knew her father, Thomas Wilson. We started out in medicine together 30 years ago." Oscar looked at him in surprise. Mrs. Donovan was writing something quickly in her notebook. "Tom was a brilliant surgeon," Mr. Harrison continued. "He saved hundreds of lives. When I was diagnosed with cancer, he performed an operation that gave me 20 more years of life." He went back to the table and picked up a photo in a silver frame. "He died 2 years ago. He was in a hurry for a complicated operation and had an accident. His wife had died even earlier, and Laura was left alone with a young son." "But why didn't she come to you for help?" Mrs. Donovan couldn't resist. Mr. Harrison smiled bitterly. "Pride, the same as her father's. Tom never asked for help, not even when he was dying." He looked at Oscar again. "I've been watching you, Mr. Richardson. I've seen you work overtime. I've seen you make up the shortfall in the cash register out of your own pocket." Richard flinched. "Sir, but I've been reporting—" "What, Richard?" Mr. Harrison interrupted him sharply. "About how you've been delaying your employees' salaries. How you demand additional reports in the middle of the night." The regional manager's face turned white as chalk. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "You understand everything." Mr. Harrison pulled out another folder from the drawer. "Here is the report of the real audit that lasted for the last 3 months. You've been systematically embezzling profits and manipulating your accounts." Richard took a step back. "This is slander. I demand—" "You will not demand anything." The owner's voice became icy. "Mrs. Donovan, call security. Have them escort Mr. Pierce to the exit. And tonight I expect a detailed report on all his machinations." After Richard was escorted out, Mr. Harrison turned to Oscar. "You did the right thing last night. You helped a man in trouble regardless of the possible consequences. But I broke the rules." "Rules are made by people," Mr. Harrison interrupted, "and sometimes you have to break them to stay human. Tom always said that." He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. "I have a proposal for you. I've seen your personal file, medical degree, excellent recommendations from the university. Why are you working as a cashier?" Oscar looked down. "After my mother died, I had debts for treatment, and then the hospital downsized." "I see," Mr. Harrison nodded. "Well, we need a new regional manager, someone who understands not only the numbers but also the people." Oscar could not believe his ears. "You're offering me Richard's position?" "Yes," Mr. Harrison smiled, "with a full social package and a salary 3 times higher than the current one. I have no management experience. But you have what's more important, heart and principles. Everything else can be learned. He handed Oscar a business card. Think about it until tomorrow. And one more thing, he took out an envelope. Here is the award for last night. I think you'll need the money for rent. Oscar felt something tighten in his throat. How do you know about— I know a lot of things. Mr. Harrison stood up. Robert, the most important thing is to see people, not numbers in reports. He was right. When Oscar left the office, Laura and Michael were waiting for him in the reception area. Mr. Harrison called me this morning, she said. He told me everything. I didn't even know he knew my father. Michael ran up to Oscar and hugged his legs. Thank you for saving me yesterday. Oscar smiled in confusion. Just yesterday he thought his life was going down the drain, but today everything changed. Let's have breakfast together, Laura suddenly suggested. I know a great coffee shop nearby. Oscar looked at her, at Michael, who was still holding onto his legs, and realized that sometimes one good deed can change a whole life. I'd love to, he said. I have some free time. As they walked to the elevator, Michael took his hand and hummed something softly, and Laura looked at them and smiled, as warmly and sincerely as her father had once smiled. 3 months passed. Oscar sat in his new office and looked over the reports. He was now in charge of not just one pharmacy, but the entire regional branch of Medcare. There was a knock at the door. Margaret appeared on the threshold holding a cup of coffee. Up late again, boy? She smiled. It was already 9 in the evening. Oscar looked up from his papers. Margaret, you know I can't just go home now. I know. She put the coffee on the table. But you've become too serious. Where's that funny guy who used to joke with me on the night shift? He got a promotion. Oscar laughed, but suddenly turned serious. Margaret, tell me honestly, don't people think I got this position undeservedly? The cleaning lady sat down across from me. You've done more in these months than Richard did in 3 years. You raised salaries, organized health insurance for all employees, opened a night shift at the pharmacies. Suddenly, I heard quick footsteps in the corridor and little Michael flew into the office. Oscar, look what I have. Laura came in behind him, holding some paper. I'm sorry I'm so late. Michael really wanted to show you his report card. All his grades are excellent, the boy boasted, and not a single asthma attack in a whole month. Oscar took the report card and patted Michael on the head. Well done. You deserve an ice cream, right? The boy's eyes shone. Mom, can I have some? Laura smiled. Only if Oscar is not too busy. Margaret winked at Oscar. Oh, our director was just going home. Yes, of course. Oscar began to gather his papers, especially since there is a reason to celebrate. They went outside. The evening city was shining with lights. Michael ran ahead, telling about his school adventures. You know, Laura said quietly, I often think about that night. What would have happened if you hadn't helped us then? Oscar stopped. I just couldn't do otherwise. And it changed our lives, Laura looked into his eyes. Not just because of Mr. Harrison, but because I realized that there are still good people in the world. Mom, Oscar, Michael called out. I know a great cafe around the corner. The 3 of them walked down the street. Oscar looked at Laura and Michael and thought about how strange everything had turned out. 3 months ago, he was barely making ends meet, and now he had a job he had never even dreamed of. He had the opportunity to help people not only with words, but also with deeds. And most importantly, he was surrounded by people who became almost like family. At the cafe, Michael immediately ordered a huge ice cream with 3 scoops. Laura looked at her son with tenderness. Sometimes I think maybe it was fate, that we went to that particular pharmacy on that particular night. You know, Oscar replied, I don't believe in accidents anymore. Everything has its own meaning. Suddenly, his phone rang. Mr. Harrison's name appeared on the screen. Oscar, The network owner's voice sounded solemn. "I've just signed an order. Starting next month, we're opening a free pharmacy for low-income families. Will you head the project?" Oscar looked at Laura, at Michael, who was eating his ice cream with gusto. "I'd be happy to, sir. I already have a few ideas." "I knew I could count on you," Mr. Harrison said, a smile in his voice. "By the way, how are Laura and Michael?" Oscar looked at the phone in surprise. "Where are you from?" "Experience, son. And something else Tom would be happy about for his daughter." When the conversation ended, Laura looked at Oscar questioningly. "Did something happen?" "No," he smiled. "On the contrary, everything is just beginning." They sat in the cafe until it closed. Michael fell asleep, leaning against his mother. Oscar looked at them and thought that sometimes the most important things in life cannot be measured by money or positions. Sometimes they are measured by simple actions, sincere smiles, and the warmth of people's hearts. When they went outside, the first snow began to fall. Michael woke up and looked at the white snowflakes with delight. "You know," Laura said, "my father always said, 'Goodness is returned when it is done from the heart.'" "Your father was a wise man," Oscar replied, taking Michael in his arms. They walked down the snowy street, leaving footprints in the fresh snow. A new life was ahead of them, a life that had room for good deeds, for sincere feelings, and for small miracles that happen when you least expect them. And in Oscar's pocket was the key to his new office with a sign that read, "Director of Social Projects." But that was a completely different story.